In order for firms to be competitive in a truly global marketplace, they must maintain a network of competent and capable suppliers. This week on Lokad TV, we're joined by Muddassir Ahmed, who's going to discuss with us what companies can do to extract the maximum value from these relationships and how they can maintain and build trust across their networks. So Muddassir, thanks very much for joining us today. Perhaps just to start us off, you could just tell us a little bit more about your background, your role perhaps at Bridgestone, and also your blog, the SCM Dojo.
Thanks for having me. My name is Dr. Muddassir Ahmed. I'm originally from Pakistan. I did my engineering back there. Then I went to Sweden, so did my master's in management of production. Then I have an opportunity to go and do a full-time PhD from Lancaster University Management School in UK. Then I was fortunate enough to find a job in a company called Eaton. I worked there 12 years and moved my full-time PhD to part-time, and it was funded by them. This is where I have done my research on a supply development framework, which is my core subject. And I think 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to move to Dubai to be close to my family. And I work right now as a head of planning and operations.
Okay, great. And today, Johannes, our topic is going to be exploring a little bit more about the relationships between supply chain practitioners and suppliers. As a starter, I mean, what have you kind of observed here?
It's interesting. I mean, over the last 2 decades, I think that the lines have grown more and more blurry about, who is a supplier, who is a client, who is a competitor. It's maybe not for, I would say, super heavy process industries like Bridgestone, but for many other verticals, let's say, fashion or consumer electronics, or there are plenty of other industries where with the advent of e-commerce, as soon as you produce something, you can sell it yourself, which suddenly begs the question of, whenever you have a supplier that is where you're buying something and you're just doing some kind of little assembly on top and reselling, well, your supplier can become a competitor. But it can also become an ally because they are much more familiar with what you're actually doing. So you see, it's interesting because I see that the potential for competition is basically the same than it is for cooperation. So that's I would say a new world where it's more complex and where, on the contrary, many companies have gone pretty much in terms of relationships the opposite way, which is to basically kind of, I would say, Uberize, your suppliers, where you just have gigantic marketplaces like Alibaba, where you can source pretty much everything with in contrast, very little knowledge about your supplier. So it's very interesting why the potential for cooperation has been growing steadily, I believe. I've seen that many companies were taking the exact opposite stance and going for things where with marketplaces where, on the contrary, they have little relationship and literally they know very little about their own suppliers.
Okay. And Muddassir, we're kind of seeing at the minute in the kind of marketplace, due to these issues with coronavirus, is that there are a lot of businesses and a lot of companies that are incredibly reliant on their suppliers. So what kind of issues can occur in a supply chain due to this sort of over-reliance?
As you can see, here what's happening in the news, a big impact on the USA as economy, $11 trillion. So as China, the GDP is down, the global impact in the supply chain, it's growing. Italy on lockdown, the financial industry is at its lowest point. It's a really serious point of concern. What actually happening in supply chain? People are going towards stockpiling, and I don't think it's a good strategy because they are now inducing a fake demand. Fake demand means, creating a bullwhip effect. That means they are basically capacity constraint, which should not be a capacity constraint. So that's, I think, is a serious impact, and I think we should try to resolve it. It has created some sort of constraints, especially the electronic industry, as you can see, has been massively impacted because 60 to 70% of the semiconductors come from China, and now they are the supply chain is almost on hold. It's impacting that. Similarly, what's happening with the For example, in our tire industry, the molds and certain parts come from China, which is not coming. It's impacting their supply as well. All the manufacturing in Italy is also have been impacted as well because of this. So it's a serious issue, and I do hope it gets better.
Okay, Muddassir kind of mentioned it there, that idea of stockpiling. What are kind of some of the strategies that a business can take to kind of minimize the impact that being kind of reliant on suppliers?
I mean, the overall idea is that you want to kind of maximize your options. That's the thing about whenever you have risks, usually it's a bit of a dead end to say you're going to predict, when and where the problem will happen. Because usually, it's things that are rare, but you know that ultimately it will happen somewhere at some point. For example, and it can take many forms. It can take the form of let's say, of a disease that is creating problem in a region of the world, or pretty much soon probably many regions on the world, unfortunately. But it can also take the form of geopolitical games, for example, with the Trump administration that has been raising, tax levels for imports for the USA. It can take many forms, or sometimes it can take, like the 737 MAX variant, which is grounded, which is a World Series of aircraft, which is all having the same problem. So it creates like systemic problem. So as a rule of thumb, I mean, stockpiling is just one way to kind of mitigate a certain class of problems. For example, stockpiling will not protect you from, for example, problems where you have like a recall. Let's say, because if you have like gigantic stockpile of something and then you have a recall because the materials are not good, because your supplier had a quality problem, a safety hazard that was diagnosed, and suddenly your stockpile is worth nothing. So stockpiling only prevents certain classes of problem. It doesn't prevent, all sorts of risks that you can have with your suppliers in supply chain. But if you want to multiple options, it's interesting is that suddenly, unless you want to do it the old way is to have a lot of people who know a lot of things, and it's expensive. The alternative is you need to have like better, richer, more agile IT systems, which is usually not necessarily, I would say, the strong forte of most supply chains.
Okay, and Muddassir, another kind of strategy that we're seeing a lot of businesses do these days, companies like Apple, is to vertically integrate. So what are the real benefits of kind of doing something like that?
I think I'd like to explain my definition of vertical integration, which I read in the books, that where manufacturing you go and either buy a supplier or basically bring your core competencies in-house, and don't want to rely on supplier. So by that definition, I don't think Apple is really vertically integrated, because Apple has kept his design and technology and intellectual property in-house, and most of the manufacturing is moved to a Taiwanese supplier, Foxconn, which we all know. They heavily rely on that. There's a long-term partnership in place with them. Foxconn is the fourth largest manufacturer of the consumer electronics by revenue. They supply to Xbox, they supply to Xiaomi, they supply to Nokia. So not just Apple. So they are really good in manufacturing mobile, all the consumer electronic goods. Having said that, and I think Apple did the right thing, relying on one person and giving finding a partner whose expertise lies in the making of consumer electronics. But what they've done very well is created a strategic partnership. So giving the core competency what they have and the supplier have, I think is a very good alliance. But in some industries, it's not possible. For example, if you take a tire industry, where you cannot really find a strategic supplier in a sense that most of the manufacturing process is very back and forth. You buy the raw material and basically you should get the tire at the end. It very much works in a flow line. Each tire industry or tire plant costs about $300 million. So the market, the barrier to entry is pretty high, so you wouldn't see that. So that's another impact to that.
Okay, and this kind of goes back to what you were sort of saying, Johannes, about the line between competitors and suppliers is very much something that's becoming blurred. Is this something that benefits all parties then?
I mean, it forces certainly the parties to really rethink where are their added values. I mean, it's very interesting because you see, if I take let's say the 20th century supply chains, it was all about economies of scale. You do it, you produce bigger quantities, you achieve lower price, and that's something that has made mankind fantastically rich, I would say, through the course of the 20th century. In aggregate, obviously, some countries are much poorer than others, and etc. But the interesting thing is that what we have discovered in the 21st century or revisited was that you have also tons of diseconomies of scale. It's very complex, very difficult to be super good at everything. It does not scale as well. So that's why, yes, there are many situations where vertical integration would be the best, but you realize that if you do that, you kind of lose your focus unless you have the physical forces of the market, such as sometimes in tires, in the tire industry, the very way you manufacture the tires themselves. If you don't have super strong force that push you toward that, you're better to have some kind of specialization. And that's interesting because what we are saying is that, for example, when it comes, let's say, to retail, I mean, let's say very innovative actors, let's say Amazons, are revisiting what does it mean to be a good retailer. I mean, it means to be able to ship, one unit and do same-day delivery with very high quality, very low cost, etc. So it's literally a new game, and they revisit entirely what is the sort of competencies that you need to achieve that. So I believe that if we go back to those suppliers that can become your competitors, I mean, the companies that benefit the most these sort of things are the companies who find angles to really add tons of value, even if ultimately it looks like it's the same products that get served in the end. It's just that it's not exactly the same thing to have your Amazon premium, same day delivery, as opposed to take your car, drive half an hour and go to a mall to get the one unit that you need. So in the end, it can be very, very different from the client perspective.
Okay, and let's talk a bit about that client perspective. Here at Lokad, one of the key challenges we kind of see is that there's a huge variations in lead times. I mean, we're working in a really international supply chain. You've got suppliers in China, in Europe, in South America. That international supply chain is meaning that lead times are becoming incredibly variable. So Muddassir, are there any sort of techniques we can use to ensure that these suppliers are more consistent?
It's a very, very important question to answer. I think it's one of the most underrated problems. So I would like to answer this question in two parts. I think the first and the most critical is to understand what is the impact. The impact is actually four key issues with the supplier lead time variation. The first one is on inventory. So if the supplier is not supplying on time, that means is impacting on safety stock, which is calculated by total demand, total lead time, supply variation, and lead time variation. The lead time variation, you are forced to carry more is stock. That means more inventory carrying cost. That means higher cost of producing goods, means you're not making enough money. So that's the one impact. The second impact would be other way around, which is not having the right inventory, right? That means raw material is not there, which causes production delays or production stoppages. That means people are either producing goods which they should not produce, or there is an idle capital of machines sitting doing nothing. Again, your fixed cost is getting high. So production stoppages is the second one. The third one is you don't have the right inventory to supply to your customers. That means a loss of sales, loss of revenue, which leads to sometime on the fourth one, which is a loss of market share. I have seen in the examples where the suppliers are not supplying parts on time, the end customer is not getting the goods, and somebody else is getting the market share, which you are not getting back. And that leads to the fifth one, which is a poor relationship between the customer and the supplier across the supply chain. So how we can solve it? I think I see the issues from two angles. One is a more reactive supply development, which is you have a right KPI, you measure the on-time delivery, you measure the total lead time, and tell them how to improve it. You don't get involved, right? have a weekly call, be tough with them in some instances. But I would like to prefer more strategic approach where you work with the supplier, understand what's happening, and ask and work with them to improve. So for example, with my 20% supply, which 80% of the spend, I used to go and work with them and have a, almost like a value stream mapping event, do the Kaizen burst, come up with action plan, and help them improve whatever the issue causing them for the inconsistent lead time. And that also helps to build the relationship and the long-term sustainable performance from the supplier. So you can mix both. I'm not saying they are mutually exclusive. You can both reactive approach and a strategic approach depending on your resources you have and the relationship with your suppliers.
And another kind of technique we've kind of spoken about previously is this idea of kind of sharing forecasts and sharing information between different companies. So sharing that information with your suppliers. How well does that actually work in practice?
My personal experience was that sharing forecasts works poorly. It's a fairly, I would say, intricate process. It's complicated, and again, the problem is that your forecast itself is imperfect. I mean, if the forecast was perfect, then it might work. Usually, it's not. So usually, I've seen that these sort of things are typically not working that good. Simpler techniques actually working better, but they requires a higher level of trust. For example, what I've seen used with success is just, for example, suppliers sharing with their clients their stock levels. It's frequently done with, for example, for car parts in the automotive industry. So you can literally probe the stock level of your supplier. Obviously, this stock is not dedicated to you, but at least you get a sense on whether, because usually it might not even very clear whether you are driving half of the consumption of the inventory of the supplier, in which case you really need to have like a tight relationship with this supplier, or if you're driving 0.5% of the consumption of the inventory, and in which case you are anyway, I would say, a completely secondary player, and thus you have very, very little leverage to do anything. So that's sort of things that can steer the discussion toward where are you, where you are basically the dominant client, and thus basically the supplier is creating a buffer, but basically primarily for you, and thus normally you would have to pay you would have to pay for it, and it's a fairly reasonable expectation. Or situations where you're very marginal. And then you can have all sort of, I would say, other similar problems where you can have many situations where you have replacements, substitutes, and complicated options where maybe your supplier might even know more about it than you do. So you need to get closer to even figure out what are the alternative options, because you might think, oh, I have a problem, I have a stock out, and then the supplier might actually have an answer readily available, which is, no, you have this product that is slightly more expensive, so you would normally not pick it, but it can address, your short-term problem.
Okay, Muddassir, we're going to start sort of concluding a bit today. From your perspective, why is having a good relationship with your supplier so important?
For me, it's pretty simple. If your supplier is giving you a good customer service, which is 4 elements, a good cost at their on time, cost quality with the right quality, and a good consistent lead time. And if you're supplying in a good cost at on time with the right quality and with consistent lead time, then your customers are happy. When your customers are happy, you're getting consistent business, you're giving your supplier consistent business, everybody makes money, and life is good. So it is, for me, sometimes it is as simple as that, nothing more complicated.
Okay, Janice, we'll leave the final point to you. What can companies do in order to extract the maximum value kind of from their relationships with suppliers?
Typically I would say usually it's get closer to them IT-wise. It's very, I frequently observe, how much unplanned work goes into dealing with super mundane problems with your suppliers, with like orders reconciliation, misunderstanding on even things as basic as the quantities that were supposed to be ordered, the time of delivery and everything. So to have like a very, I would say, high quality production grade ADI where the data is flowing, I would say, flawlessly, goes a long way. And then beyond that, I very much agree with what was just said, which is if you want to do anything beyond that, you need to know them, and knowing them takes time and effort, and you will have to pay for that. And so you need to prioritize that. But ultimately, there is no free lunch, and thus I would say usually it's. And if we go back, to things like sharing forecasts, my perspective is that usually time is better invested on actually having potentially relatively informal discussion with suppliers. But trying to pinpoint things that you've not even started to consider, as opposed to try to invest a lot of time on, I would say, unreliable numbers like moving forecasts around, because your suppliers, they see your historical orders as well. So they can do a forecast on their own, and it's not very clear that your forecast is going to be much better than their forecast. I mean, bullwhip problems put aside, which can be very real. But then you need, the problem is that the forecast can be game, so they can't really trust your forecast to be completely accurate. So back to business is that usually I would say perfect IT execution plus high-level intelligent discussion, I would say for me that goes very much a long way in having good relationship.
Okay, brilliant. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you both for your time. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.